There's a pretty popular meme going around right now on TikTok and Facebook that Easter isn't a Christian holiday. It's actually just a holiday that Christians took over. But is it true? Is there evidence for this? We're going to figure out today on today's episode of the ADHD Apologist. In order for us to really dive into, is Easter really a Christian holiday or is it pagan, we have to kind of look back at the history of Easter. Did it predate even the word Easter? Easter's roots go all the way back to the resurrection of Jesus, which happened at Passover. The earliest Christians, many of whom were Jewish, continued to celebrate Passover because it was around the same time when Jesus resurrected from the dead. Instead of seeing Passover as just a celebration of being delivered from Egypt, they began to see Jesus as the true Passover lamb that had been slain to free the world of their sins. By the time the 2nd century had rolled around, Christians had developed their own holiday called Pascha, which is Greek for Passover, which focused on the resurrection of Jesus. Although this celebration had roots that go all the way back to the resurrection, Christians disagreed about when to celebrate Easter. Some followed the Jewish calendar, celebrating on the 14th of Nisan, which is Passover. Others believed that Pascha should always be celebrated on Sunday, since that is when Jesus rose. It also followed with the tradition of worship being on Sunday for believers. In 325 AD, the Council of Nicaea settled this issue. They did this by setting Easter on the first Sunday after the full moon of the spring equinox. While Romans did have some pagan celebrations around the equinoxes and things like that, that's not to insinuate or not to say that them putting it on this day was transforming that already existing tradition and just making something new out of it, but that they just simply put their celebration, their holiday on that day, because pagan or not, the spring equinox is still the spring equinox, right? It's still important. It's still the time when spring is coming. By making it the first Sunday after the full moon of the spring equinox, they ensured that it would always be on a Sunday, and it separated Easter or Pascha from the Jewish celebration of Passover and made it its own Christian celebration. As Christianity spread, Pascha became one of the most important Christian holidays. In many traditions, it was marked by Lent, but also things such as Palm Sunday, Good Friday, and Resurrection Sunday. And much later, over time, different traditions began to emerge, things like Easter eggs and the Easter Bunny. Point is that Pascha, even before the name was changed to Easter, the English word Easter, Pascha has been a celebration that has been going on for thousands of years, all the way back to the early church. Despite pagan traditions or secular traditions, the focus of Pascha has always been the resurrection of Jesus. A common myth about Easter, and specifically the name Easter, some claim Easter comes from Eoster, a pagan goddess, or even Ishtar, which is a Babylonian goddess. But the evidence for this doesn't hold up. The only reference to Eoster that we have is from a monk called Bede from the 8th century. And we don't have any evidence of widespread worship of Easter or a connection between her and eggs and rabbits. This is what Bede says. He says, "Nor is it irrelevant if we take the time to translate the names of the other months. Hrethmanath is named after the goddess Hretha, to whom they sacrificed at this time. Eostermanath has a name which is now translated Paschal month, and which was once called after a goddess of theirs named Eoster, in whose honor feasts were celebrated in that month. Now they designate that Paschal season by its name, calling the joys of the new rite by the time-honored name of the old observance." And people like to take Bede and somewhat misinterpret what he's saying here. What he's not saying is that Christians saw this festival or this evil thing that was happening, and then they just decided, hey, let's co-opt it for ourselves and turn what's bad into something good. What he's saying is the name that's used for it is simply taken from the month that it's in. This would be like trying to make an argument that the 4th of July, which we celebrate every year, is pagan because July is named after Julius Caesar. Obviously, if you celebrate the 4th of July, you're actually celebrating and worshiping Julius Caesar. As we can see, this logic is kind of flawed, right? Because of where we are and the context in which we live, it no longer means that. But this is so often what's used to try to say that Easter, the celebration of Easter, is actually just a pagan practice. That doesn't mean that there's a direct connection between me saying Easter, talking about the resurrection of Jesus, as me worshiping a pagan goddess. And here's where we get into the weeds a little bit. The word Easter actually most likely comes from the German word Oster. Oster, or Ostern being the modern day equivalent, which basically means the rising of the sun, or the east. So it would make sense that this word may have been adopted for Easter Sunday or Easter morning. When we put these two together, we see that Oster, or what eventually becomes Easter when translated into English, was actually Easter. It was actually Pascha. But wait, maybe it's not Eoster, but what if it's Ishtar? This idea that Ishtar and Eoster are the same goddess, or all of these different goddesses that we see in Mesopotamia are the same Babylonian goddess, comes from this guy named Alexander Hislop. Hislop was a 19th century Protestant minister who wrote a really famous book called The Two Babylons. In his book, he argued that most Catholic traditions, if not all, originated from Babylonian pagan tradition. His book, while maybe well-intentioned, was not very credible, and in fact it has sparked a lot of the reason why we see many pagan Christianity mixed myths in today's society. The problem is Hislop had a very limited understanding of ancient languages, as well as the history and the connections of the points that he made and the gods and the goddesses that he tried to connect together. Even Ralph Woodrow, who was once a follower of Hislop, he wrote a really famous book called Babylon Mystery Religion. After spending several years teaching this theory and what Hislop had proposed, he actually took his book out of publishing and he took his book off of print because he realized that Hislop's arguments and the connections he makes from Christianity and the Roman Catholic Church to paganism, while some of them are true, a lot of them just don't really connect. This is what Ralph Woodrow says about Hislop's work. He says, citing a similarity does not provide proof. There must be a legitimate connection. Take enough names, enough stories, and enough centuries, translate from one language to another, and a careless writer might pass on all kinds of misinformation. He also gives an example that I thought is really excellent about McDonald's. If we look back at history, we can look back at Babylon and see that, hey, they used arches. They used arches in their construction. We can look back and see that it was called the Golden City. Well, obviously, if we look at McDonald's are really Babylonians. You see, this logic just doesn't work. Right? It's a false equivalence argument. It's an argument that sure, things may look similar or have similar themes, similar language, or similar practices, and then say, well, these two are just the same thing. Another problem with Hislop's conclusions, a lot of them are based on the words sounding similar. Ishtar, he assumed sounded or was pronounced more like Easter. Eoster, that it would be pronounced more like Easter. But what he fails to realize is that there's historical context that each of these goddesses and religions are placed in that honestly have nothing to do with each other. Ishtar was worshipped mainly in Mesopotamia around 3000 BC to 331 BC, long before Christianity. And the only account we have of Eoster being worshipped is from Bede, which is in the 6th century. This is nearly 900 to 1,000 years apart and away from each other. So then to take those two pieces of evidence and tie them together and say that these are really just the same goddess just doesn't follow through. And here's what's interesting. Most of the world today doesn't even call it Easter. Most of the world either uses Pascha or a derivative of that name of Passover to describe this celebration that we have of Jesus' resurrection. So why do English speakers call Pascha or Passover Easter? Most of this has to do with a guy named William Tyndale. He's really famous for translating the Greek and Hebrew Bible into English. In 1525, he translated the New Testament into English, and he used the word Esther, E-S-T-E-R, to refer to Passover. Later, the term evolved into Easter, adding the A to the word. Here's the point. Even if Easter had some ancient connection, even if maybe it was named after a month that was named after a goddess or whatever, we obviously know about that the time Tyndale translates the New Testament, it had no meaning as to that. The early church, the early Christians, especially people like Tyndale and Martin Luther, wouldn't have used the name of a known pagan goddess in order to translate the Bible and refer to the resurrection of Jesus. So should we call it Easter? The term Easter is not pagan inherently, but if it does bother you, that's okay. You have the freedom to use whatever term you want to use. Pascha. A lot of Protestants, I'm a Baptist, a lot of Baptists began to refer to Easter Sunday as Resurrection Sunday, but I want us to understand there's no reason to attack each other on this issue. Whether you use Easter or whether you use Resurrection Sunday, both are equally historically valid and are not pagan. So sure, maybe Easter isn't pagan. Maybe it's just an English translation of the word Passover or Pascha, but surely the rabbits and the eggs and the things that we see all around during the Easter season, those aren't Christian. What do those have to do with the resurrection story? Why are they involved? And I'm not saying they're right. I will agree there's been a huge commercialization of Easter, just like with Christmas. It's all about Santa Claus and gifts more than the birth of our Savior. Easter is slowly becoming more about eggs and bunnies than it is about the resurrection of Christ. So where did these things come from, and how did they get associated with Easter? So some early Christians used the egg as a symbol of the resurrection. If you think about it, eggs have a picture of life and new life in the same way that Jesus was resurrected from the dead. They would use the cracked or empty eggshell to be a symbol for the empty tomb. Another reason eggs would have been really popular around that time was because eggs were once forbidden during Lent. So while Lent was going on, your chickens kept laying eggs. They didn't stop laying eggs, but you had to wait a week or two to eat them. So one of the ways that some Christians in medieval times would celebrate Easter was by having a feast of all the hard-boiled eggs that their chickens had laid over Lent. We see the dying of eggs start, while yes, some pagans did it, in the church it ultimately started with Orthodox Christians dyeing them red to signify Jesus' blood. They would use wax to make designs and create pictures on the eggs like you see behind me. These eggs are beautiful and ornate, and I could never do that, right? Like, I'm the kind of guy that mixes together some different kinds of dyes and makes like just a plain colored egg, right? But the point is, while eggs may have some pagan roots, it's also a beautiful picture of the resurrection from early Christians. So eggs were actually popularized by King Edward I, or King Edward Longshanks, which is a funny name, but it's because he had long legs. He was 6'2", which is not that tall today, but was very tall back then. And King Edward had about 450 eggs coated with gold leaf and designs and given as gifts to his friends and family on Easter. And this happened in around 1290. So again, this is a relatively not new, but also new tradition, right? It doesn't go all the way back to like the 1st or 2nd century, but it was mostly popularized by King Edward. Well, what about the Easter bunny? Surely this picture of fertility has to relate to some goddess, right? But the truth is, most of the stories that you hear on Facebook or elsewhere about gods like Eoster don't have any historical credibility. Usually it's from one source, and then that one source is taken out of context to support a pagan worldview. Typically in Europe, rabbits had their mating season in March or April when Easter was coming around. And so when spring came and rabbits came out and they start showing up everywhere and they're boxing and fighting for mates, people began to associate rabbits with spring and rabbits with Easter. The Easter bunny mainly comes from German Lutheran immigrants in the 1700s to the US, not from ancient paganism. And I'm not trying to defend that these should be our main focus on Easter. I'm simply saying, if you look into the claims that these are the proof that paganism is the foundation of Easter, you find that doesn't go very far. But here's the main point. Whether you choose to hide eggs or you choose to do the Easter bunny for your kids, maybe your parents did the Easter bunny for you, the focus of Easter should always be Christ's resurrection. Whether you call it Easter or Pascha or whatever, it should always be about death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. That's the main hope we have as Christians. We have to remember that Romans 14 applies here. If you're convicted that the Easter bunny and eggs are not pagan and that you're using it as a celebration of what Jesus has done in good ways, not making it all about the rabbits and the eggs, but maybe you teach your kids through egg painting about the resurrection of Jesus and about church history, then do that. Have a clear conscience, love Jesus, and glorify Him. But if you are convicted that, hey, this isn't right, I feel like this is a blending of Christianity and paganism, then don't do it. But we should also have love for one another. That's why I think it's not necessarily a bad thing for churches to refer to Easter as Resurrection Sunday. Some people may have a conviction about that. But on the other hand, the people that have a conviction about that should also have love for the people that don't. We have to fight for unity and love one another, not just try to one-up each other or I know more than you do and I'm right and you're wrong all the time, but genuinely looking at the facts, genuinely looking at church history and seeing how can we best love each other and how can we best love Jesus. So what's your favorite Easter tradition? Is it the eggs? Is it the bunnies? One of my favorites from my childhood that I remember is I don't know what they're like, puff pastry, where you put the marshmallow in the middle and then you bake it and the marshmallow's gone because it melts, and it's a picture of Jesus' resurrection and the tomb being empty. I think that's a really cool one. So what's your favorite tradition about Easter? Leave it in the comments below. If you haven't already, make sure to like and subscribe. There's gonna be more videos coming out out soon. Thank you all for watching this one. If you have any questions about Christianity or about Easter, leave them in the comments below and I may just answer them in an upcoming video. Thank you for watching. I hope y'all have a blessed day. I'll see y'all next time.